All right, we're going to get started now because I know Dr. Harvey has a lot of things to share with you all. I just wanted to give you a little background on Dr. Harvey. She's a professor at Mason, and she's serving as the interim director of the Women and Gender Studies Department this year. And she has a lot of specialty that I think you really all are going to learn a good amount from, such as early modern women's writing and feminist theory itself. So, Dr. Harvey, take it over.
All right. Good morning. I'm really excited to do this. I will say one thing. I'm about to start the formal presentation thing with PowerPoint, and that means I can't really see your chat or raising hands and things like that. So and yet I want you to interrupt me, participate, ask questions. I may be going too slowly, I may be going too quickly, you may have other things you want to bring in. So it may be necessary for you to just turn on your mics and introduce your questions. But in short, feel free to interrupt me. And there are places where pretty quickly where I'm going to be asking you for feedback. So I'm going to start my slide presentation. And I guess what I'm explaining is I see nothing in terms of the Blackboard once I turn this on. All I see is my own PowerPoint, which is a really strange experience. And here is the PowerPoint. All right, so again, my name's Tamara Harvey. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I focus on early American women writers across the Americas. So in New Spain, New France, British North America, in predominantly the 17th century. But a lot of my work is on feminist theory. What I argue strongly is feminist theory in this period. And so you'll see that my emphasis, my focus, my research focus on the 17th century has shaped the way I think about feminist theory in perhaps distinctive ways. I don't know how distinctive it is. What I wanted to begin with are some definitions of feminism that help me ground our discussion of feminist theory today. The first two are from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. And so for this, really early on, I want you to participate a little bit if you're willing. The first definition, excuse me, I'm going to cough, is that feminism is the theory of the political, economic, and social equality of the sexes. And the second definition in the Merriam-Webster, and they're just these two definitions, is that feminism is organized activity on behalf of women's rights and interests. And so if you're willing, this is my question right now. What are you noticing in these two definitions? What do they encompass? Why do you need two entries? And how do the two entries work together? And also perhaps how is feminism being delimited, and what maybe is being left out of these two definitions? Any thoughts about that? And actually, you know what? I am going to already get escape out of this so I can see your hands. And that actually changes everything, doesn't it? Anyone want to think a little bit about those two?
Come on, y'all, you can do it.
All right, I think it's early. That's okay. I'm going to go back to the presentation. Please just jump in. And of course, this changes how the PowerPoint plus the Blackboard, it's hard. All right, so one of the things I notice in these two definitions is that they focus on theory and activity, right? And you have to have those two things together. So I think it's one of the really clever, good things that Merriam-Webster does in having these two definitions. Feminism, feminist theory are social theories, and they're always associated with change, right? If we had a completely egalitarian society without misogyny, without patriarchy, without discrimination, feminism would be almost unnecessary. Maybe people would like to say, look at this crazy thing that happened in the past. But it's not. It's totally associated with current efforts to make social change, which means you always have theory and activity, right? The theory is aimed at change and thus activity, and the activism requires theory to think about the grounds for change, to come up with strategies, to animate the activism, right? So you have theory plus activity, and that's going to be important throughout our discussion of feminist theory. Another thing I notice here, and this again, I said I study the 17th century, is that these two definitions emphasize social equality and women's rights. They focus on ideas of equality and rights that I read as meaning that this, excuse me, again, cat hair in my, I was talking about this earlier, I have a cat that has just been rubbing all over my face, and I have to cough. That this is coming from a post-Enlightenment idea about individual equality and rights. That means that this definition of feminism is most associated with 19th, 20th, and now 21st century modern democracies, where individual rights reign as a value and an organizing concept, right? So for me, a focus on equality and rights in this way, in some ways marginalizes 17th century feminisms and feminisms that are located in institutions or countries that are not particularly concerned with individual rights and equality. The other thing I see in this definition is that it focuses on social equality of the sexes. And so in talking about equality of the sexes in this way, this presumes, I would argue, a sense of that two sexes, male and female, a sexual binary, is natural, right? That you can have male and an equal sign and female, right? The equality, as well as just the idea of the sexes, is taken as natural. And that too leaves out the kind of research I do, because a little bit, or marginalizes it a little bit, because that idea of a binary notion of the sexes is historically and culturally specific, right? Before the rise of biological science, the 18th century biological sciences, sexual difference was also often understood in terms of heat, right? This is I don't know if this sounds weird or is familiar, but it comes out of Aristotle, it comes out of Galen and other early biological theories. And the idea is that men are hotter and thus better. And women, girls, are insufficiently cooked. They were, if they had been hotter in the womb, they would have come out men and they would have been superior. So instead of having equality, even the possibility of the equality of the sexes, you have a hierarchy where men are hotter than women. There's still a binary, but because of the heat, the notion of heat, there's a continuum between women and men that changes the way sexual difference works. And I would argue today, with more attention to non-binary sex and gender, we also have challenges to this kind of binary notion of the sexes that's built into the equality of the sexes. So all of which is to say, in the Merriam-Webster definition, we have an emphasis on theory and activity that I think is crucial, but we also have an assumption that equality and rights and a binary notion of the sexes is animating this theory and activity, and that's much more culturally and historically specific. So I offer a third definition of feminism. I like this a lot. It comes from a t-shirt. And then I chase down the source, which is Marie Scheer from a newsletter in the 60s and 70s, or in either the late 60s or early 70s, in which she wrote, "Feminism is the radical notion that women are people." And I like this. And again, I'm sort of inclined to stop and ask you to chime in, but I'll say that for a little bit later. And just think about how that works, right? So why is it on T-shirts? Because it's kind of funny and ironic, right? It would seem natural that women are people, but by calling this a radical notion, the statement is saying that it will take change, right? The idea of something being radical is that it has to radically change what is. And it is assuming that women are not understood as people in some way. And that's what's animating the statement. Now, one reason I like this is that in a lot of 16th century and 15th century writing about women, pro-woman and anti-woman, critical of women, the question, are women human, was a kind of Renaissance joke that animated a lot of these debates. And they were debates very like the debates that you're undertaking in the Debate Institute, right? People are taking a position to prove that they can argue the position. And the joke is, are women human? And often the arguments were, yeah, not really. But sometimes really good debaters would argue, actually, women are superior. But it was, it was all it was a game, kind of. And so there's a longer history of this "are women people" argument, but I think it also fits very well today with feminist arguments about the objectification of women, the sort of limitations placed on women's agency and activity in the world, and the statement itself, because it's ironic, because it's a joke, is meant to get a response, and itself, just as a rhetorical statement, spark change. All right, are there questions about these definitions of feminism or things that you want to add? I think what I can hear is if you raise your hand or chat, I hear a little bing. Okay, I'm gonna move on then. So that was feminism. I want to cover what is theory. I think you've been covering some of this in other classes, and these are things that you probably know already. But this is an outline that comes from Jonathan Culler's A Short Introduction to Literary Theory. It's a great book. I love this short introduction series, but the Culler book is really, really good. And I find this breakdown of the components of theory really helpful. And Culler is really focused on explaining theory, literary theory, but really broader cultural theories as well, that became especially important in academic settings, intellectual settings in the 70s and 80s, and it continues to today. So Culler argues that theory is interdisciplinary, right? The kinds of questions theory asks and the way they theorists approach those questions is always going to draw on psychology, right? So you think about the importance of Freud and all sorts of areas, and Freud is important in social sciences and history and literature. The one place where Freud is really not so important is in psychology these days, because as a psychologist, a lot of his theories really don't hold water or don't answer the questions that psychology wants to answer today. But they answer a lot of questions about literature and history and other theoretical areas. So you have psychology, literature, politics, philosophy, all pulled together within theory. Theory is analytical and speculative. So it's analytical, it breaks things down, it shows things, how things work, and it often takes something that seems natural and entire and pulls it apart. So if you think about chemical analysis would take, like, I don't know, Mountain Dew and boil it and freeze it and filter it and run different kinds of tests until it no longer looked like Mountain Dew, but the scientists could say, these are all the component parts of Mountain Dew, and you understand Mountain Dew better. Literary analysis does the same thing. So if we're going to analyze romantic comedies, you think about all the component parts, right? They meet cute, They have a conflict. That conflict is resolved at some point. Where does the first kiss come? Before the resolution of the conflict or after? In resolving the conflict, does it reinforce assumptions about gender hierarchies and sexual relations, or does it upset them in some way? How is closure reached? Do they live happily ever after, or is there some doubt about that? That's taking what on the surface might be just a really enjoyable love story and breaking it down, analyzing it, breaking it down into its component parts. Theory is also always speculative. It is, if there is a solution, it's not theory. If it can just be answered as truth, it's not theory. So you can't say, my theory is that Professor Harvey is wearing a purple shirt. I'm wearing a purple shirt. That's not a theory. But you could speculate about why I'm wearing a purple shirt. Is it because I think it makes me look cute? Is it because it seems like a kind of feminist color? Is it because, and I think this is really the real reason, it was top on my pile of t-shirts when I got dressed this morning. Usually the speculation of theory is about much more important things than my shirt color. But you have a kind of, it's always trying to figure something out that cannot be decided for sure. And that to me is one of the most exciting parts about theory, right? You're asking hard questions that no one has answered, that no one can answer. And so it's relevant and important, but it's also one of the most frustrating things about theory. You can never master it. There is no real right answer. And so the speculative nature of theory is really important. Theory is a critique of common sense of concepts taken as natural. And this is one of the areas where we get to a really important part of feminist theory. Feminist theory is always investigating the ways that sex and gender categories are taken as natural and challenging that naturalness. And we'll talk about that more in a moment. And then theory is reflexive. It's thinking about thinking, inquiry into the categories we use and making sense of things. And so theory, so I think one way of thinking about this is not only is it questioning concepts that are natural, but we are always living within those concepts, right? You can't just step outside of our given gender categories and ideas. We're immersed in them. And so in order to do this kind of theoretical work, you have to work within and against the language and the ideas that we're given, right? So this is Jonathan Culler's idea, his outline of the components of theory. For feminist theory, I've sort of hit on some of this, but I'll just elaborate the steps a little bit more. So again, feminist theory is frequently interdisciplinary. It draws on insights from literary studies, philosophy, natural sciences, sociology, psychology, the list goes on. I would say for feminist theory, the one thing I would emphasize more that we don't quite see in Jonathan Culler's definition is that it draws on all these disciplines in part because discrimination and discrimination takes place within all these disciplines, but also because the stakes of the theory, the desire to create social change in the future, requires that we draw on all the tools that we have, right? So you look to all the disciplines to make change.
So are you talking, sorry.
Yeah, oh, please.
Are you talking about the US or just the world in general?
Oh, that's a good question. I think, so we'll get to this in a little bit later. A lot of what we understand as feminism is, I think, defined predominantly in the US. And certainly when I'm talking about universities, I am taking the university in the US as kind of the first model. But do you think this idea of interdisciplinarity travels?
Yes.
So do you want to ask more about that? I mean, why the question?
I mean, I was just wondering because I feel like feminism could look very different around the world in different countries. Like feminism in Saudi Arabia would look very different from feminism here.
Yes, I totally agree. I think that's right. And I think that's one of the reasons that, I have questions about the Merriam-Webster definitions, right? I think they are more keyed to the United States, for instance, and the present. I think the interdisciplinarity is a fairly general, I do think that idea travels pretty well. And in fact, I think all of these ideas about theory travel pretty well, but the details are going to be very different, right? What you can do, what you can say. I think feminism in Saudi, I had a graduate student who's now a professor in Saudi Arabia, and she focused a great deal on driving, right? And the politics of driving, among other things, and did some qualitative interviews. And what the issues that she was dealing with were very different. They were, and the context and the rhetoric that she was dealing with were very different as well. So I think that your question is a great question, and one that we should all keep in mind all the time. And a lot of times it's in the details. Any other questions? All right, so I'll continue. Feminist theory is interdisciplinary, and I think because the stakes are so high. It analyzes manifestations and effects of gender hierarchies and sexual inequality, right? It breaks down how that works. And again, that's going to work differently in different parts of the country, and even in different parts of this country, right? When you look at different institutions, you look at different problems. It breaks that down in order to build things up. Yeah. Is that a question?
Oh, yeah, I was just wondering. I don't know if my screen froze, but I can only see the first slide.
You can't see so the slide I have says "So Feminist Theory."
No, I can't see that one. I just see feminism.
Oh, okay. Let me see. Maybe. Does that work better?
Yeah, I can see it now.
Okay, let me see if I can do it this way. I'm not 100% sure. That makes it more, in some ways better for me, because then I can see you raise your hands and stuff like that. But we might not get the cool effects. All right, so feminist theory analyzes sexual inequality and gender hierarchies. It speculates, remember, speculation is an important part of theory, about how social change can take place, right? So it speculates about the future. And it also is speculative in that it looks at what is hidden or only partially visible and what we know about other cultures in the past, cultures in the present, but also our own culture, wherever our own culture is, right? So a lot of the speculation of feminist theory is making visible something that's hidden because of what is more generally valued as important, neutral, and so on. So in my field, again, the archive is not very gentle to non-elites, right? To women, to people of color, to poor people. And so when you're studying non-elites in the 17th century, you often have to speculate about what they were doing, what they thought, who they were. There's all sorts of ways that you have to analyze in order to speculate about stories and experiences that are absent from the dominant narrative. Feminist theory is critical of common sense and categories taken as natural. So gender characteristics and relations between or among the sexes are often treated as natural, and feminist theory is asking us to question that naturalness. And then it asks us to think reflexively about how sex and gender categories shape how we understand the world, and how those ideas are evident in the language and social systems and laws that shape our lives. So there's a certain amount of, you can't just reject the categories, you have to work through them. And, and I think we might think about this is, do I want to go here right now? Thinking about the way the pronoun they works as a singular non-binary pronoun, they is an alternative, but built into using they is the limits and the assumptions of a language that depends on binary between he and she, right? They can't simply step out of that language and make something visible, in part because it makes visible that English does not have a neutral or non-binary pronoun, right? So you have to have a singular pronoun. So you have to have the plural to speak to the singular. It's something added that names something that we're seeing, but it has to do that through a language that's very, very limited. And that's part of the kind of reflexivity of feminist theory. All right, I'm going to play a clip, and this is where I'm hoping that I can, oops, I'm clicking the wrong place. I'm hoping this works. And this is just a tiny bit from a song that many of you have probably heard. Well, I don't know, maybe you haven't. I hope you've heard. It's an Aretha Franklin song. It's very familiar, and I am going to ask you to participate. And I just want you to think about it. It's a short clip, so I'll play it twice. It's maybe 20 seconds long. And I want you to think about how this works, right? Like what makes this song effective in this transition between the verse and the chorus, and what you know, how does it fit with what we've been saying about feminist theory? This is where I'm not sure if it will play. Okay, it does. Yeah. Before the day I met you, life was so unkind. You're the key to my peace of mind. 'Cause you make me feel, you make me feel, you make me feel like a natural woman. Right. I'm going to play that one more time. If I can get through it. You're the key to my peace of mind. 'Cause you make me feel, you make me feel, you make me feel like a natural woman. All right. So thoughts about how that works. What's going on in this clip? Like what makes it effective, and how does it fit with feminist theory? What does it mean when Aretha Franklin says, "You make me feel like a natural woman"? Or what does it, you know, how would you analyze that statement? All right, I am waiting to see, all right, crickets. I guess one of the things, and I'll just move on, that's okay. I guess one of the things I want to say about this that's really great. So I love this song. I love Aretha Franklin, period. And I love these kinds of love songs that are kind of the day before songs, where it's like, this is how crappy my life was before I met you, and then I met you and everything was different. And there are a number of songs like that, and I think they're very romantic and dramatic, and they play a lot on that day before and the transition. And in describing that transition in this song that was written by, Carole King, we have this funny phrase, right? You make me feel like a natural woman. And one of the things that's going on here is, how do you describe that feeling? That feeling when you've met the one, right? And you need to, it's like a big feeling. And she chooses here to describe that as, you make me feel like a natural woman, which, I don't know, it's rooted in an idea of gender and sexuality and something that feels right, natural. And so I think that's on the surface, or, like a big part of how this works. But it also is such a funny phrase, right? When you say, you make me feel like a natural woman, it makes it clear that she's not, right? That she is not a natural woman normally, right? That this has to be a constructed experience, that it happens in this relationship, and that it sort of doesn't stick, right? It's still like, and that temporary constructed nature of the so-called natural woman is at the heart of a lot of feminist theory. All right, so let me, oops, this is still trying to figure this out. Move on with the slides. Okay, so I am going over clearly. Let me go through the 3 waves of feminism. And this gets back in really important ways to the question about feminism around the world, right? The 3 waves of feminism are a very common way of organizing the stages of feminist activism in modern democracies from the 19th century through the present. They tend to be US focused or Western focused. I find the waves of feminism a little bit problematic because of all that they leave out, but also really instructive. It does get at something important about shifts in feminist activism over this period. And so it's one of those things that, if you're interested in feminism, you kind of have to know, even though you want to think about the limits of it. And next slide. So the waves. The first wave of feminism is generally associated with 19th and early 20th century activists, writers, and movements addressing legal inequalities, right? So this is a kind of feminism that is especially concerned with legal inequalities. There are 2 kinds of legal inequalities that are particularly important. One is winning votes for women. That's the second one on the list. I think you guys are debating issues of voting rights in some way. And this is a long-standing form of women's activism in the United States and other countries. In the US, finally the vote is won for women in 1920. But another really important fight is the fight against what's called coverture, and the notion of femme couvert. And I have it here. Femme this is how it's spelled. I realize it's not how it's spelled in French, but this is from English common law, which uses a lot of French terms and kind of misspells them. So the notion of femme couvert argued that married women did not exist as independent legal entities. The legal fiction is that once a man and a woman are married, they are one person, and that one person is the man, right? The woman effectively disappears. She's cut. So a woman alone is called femme sole. The woman, married woman, is femme couvert. And that meant that their legal rights and responsibilities became their husbands. If they owned property, the husband owned that property. If they earned money, that money belonged to the man. They could not sign contracts. They could not testify against their husbands in court. They essentially disappeared legally. And so a form of first wave feminism that's a little bit earlier than the 19th century is Abigail Adams' letter to John Adams in 1776. You've probably heard this. This is pretty famous. In which she writes, "In the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." Second, oops. second wave feminism then builds on this attention to legal inequality, and excuse me, is generally associated with movements in the 1960s through the 1980s. On the activist side of things, we might see second wave feminism as a host of actions by what we could call the women's liberation movement of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which is attending to the Equal Rights Amendment, laws related to domestic violence, gender equity in the workplace, abortion rights, and so on. A lot of sort of legal fights. And we also see in this period, excuse me, the rise of women's studies in universities. And again, this is the US predominantly, but more widely as well. So what do we have with women's studies in the universities? In English studies, when I took English literature, the first year of English literature in the mid-80s, we had one woman in the entire year-long course. We read a novel by Jane Austen, and not a single person of color in that class. That was because of the influence of women's studies. That hardly ever happens anymore. It would be a very backwards, unacceptable class to have no women or people of color in a class curriculum. In history, in sociology, in political science, in all sorts of areas, the study of sex and gender became integral to the disciplines rather than a kind of ladies' auxiliary. When you study women's history, you're not just saying, here's the main history, the political history, and it's all men. And over here is like the study of quilting or child rearing, that's women's history. The attention to gender and sex becomes integral to the disciplines. So we can see the concern with equality under the law that we saw in first wave feminism is joined to attention to theorizing gender difference, right? Gender difference becomes an important concept in second wave feminism, and difference understood as important to addressing some of these wrongs, right? So on the activist side, this involves making visible the need for processes that address both systemic and unconscious bias in workplace, in the law, and elsewhere, right? So you need to not only say men and women are equally qualified for this job, but you need to make sure that women are actually being hired, that childcare issues are being addressed, and so on, that education is being addressed, that maybe other kinds of differences between men and women are being addressed. On the scholarly and theoretical side, this involves interrogating the ways that women's different experiences have been ignored and suppressed in the service of patriarchy. So I have one example. This is from of a kind of second wave statement. This is from an essay. It's a great essay called The Laugh of the Medusa by Hélène Cixous, a French feminist writer. It is an essay that I love, and it actually makes me blush a lot. She's pretty out there, so I had to find a passage that wouldn't make me blush. And among other things, she's responding to Freudian ideas that associate women with castration, right? So Freud is seeing women as being perceived as castrated, and that's important to the development of boys and girls. So women are seen as lacking, and men are seen as the neutral, the normal, and castration is central to Freud's theories, which you may have, if you've taken AP Psych or something like that, you've probably run into. These are theories that assume that male anatomy is normal and women are lacking. So Cixous writes, but isn't this fear of castration is made evident by women's bodies convenient for them? Wouldn't the worst be, isn't the worst in truth that women aren't castrated? That they have only to stop listening to the sirens, for the sirens were men, for history to change its meaning? You only have to look at the Medusa straight on to her, and she's not deadly. She's beautiful, and she's laughing. So Sixu is pointing out that women's bodies are normal and different, and that difference has not been attended to within Western culture, right? So she's taking a story from Greek myth, the idea of Medusa. And Medusa is a monster, right? She is a sign of a threatening woman who has the very phallic snake hair, right? And Perseus, the hero, has to sneak up and look at her in the reflection of his shield and then chop her head off to defeat her. And so he kills the monstrous woman through this kind of, strange act of castration, and he becomes the hero. He is the hero in the Greek myth. And Sixu asks us to rethink this myth by imagining that the Medusa is not a monster. It is not about castration. And we can look at her and she is beautiful and she's laughing and not deadly. And so it's a text that does a lot of really interesting things, both in rethinking narrative and rethinking psychoanalytic theories and Marxist theories, but insisting that femininity is something different from what has been described before, and something that no one yet has quite been able to articulate. But one way to get at articulating it is to insist on a positive difference rather than, accepting the kind of Perseus as hero model that has dominated a lot of Western myth. All right, let me pause for just a second and ask if you have questions about this. I feel like the Sixu it's a very challenging text if we had read the whole thing. Do you have questions about second wave feminism and the distinction between first wave and second wave feminism? Great, good. All right, moving on. Jack, please.
Yeah, hey, the lab assistant, but I did think that this might be an interesting question for everyone. What would Sixtu say about the basis of Freud's psycho reasoning behind the castration stuff and I guess his original claim?
Right. Well, I think she would think that he is obsessed with phalluses and that he takes men as male anatomy and male psychology as the norm, and also that he sees women with their lack of a penis and with their, like with the power of the mother over the child as a threat and something that needs to be worked through. What he doesn't see is the idea that women's bodies and psychological development could just be different and normal. But I will say this as well, and this is, going off in a direction I hadn't anticipated, but there are lots of feminist theorists who find Freud very helpful and use him all the time. And Sixu is one of them. And that is because even if Freud's ideas about women and women's minds, women's bodies are constructed and in some ways, pretty wrong, they're also really symptomatic about how women are understood, or at least were understood in the 19th and 20th century and before, right? So he's diagnosing a problem, and a lot of times feminist theorists find him really helpful for the way he diagnoses the problem, even as they say, it's not true, right? We don't have to stay there. So there, Sixu, this is an example of how she is analyzing Freud and speculating about a future where we're no longer constrained by these notions of castration, for instance. Her speculation is what happens if we think of Medusa as beautiful and laughing rather than as a monster who is, threatening to kill the hero. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but all right, I'm going to move on to
It does,
third
thank
wave.
you. Yeah,
Thanks, yeah.
Freud with hysteria and whatnot.
Yeah. So I'm going to move on to third wave feminism. This is often dated 1990s to the present. It builds on second wave feminism. and look specifically at the kinds of omissions within and oppressions perpetuated by forms of second wave feminism that presume a white, middle-class, cisgender, heterosexual woman as the woman for whom feminism speaks. And so there are many, many different forms of third wave feminist critique. Two really dominant ones that I list here are a critique of essentialist notions of woman within feminist theory. And so that's often a critique. I think it's unfair, but it gets leveled against Cixous in part because of her rhetoric and other feminists of the second wave that write like her, that they seem to be drawing on or moving towards an essential notion of femininity that somehow has escaped, that the patriarchy hasn't allowed. It seems like the answer could be fairly homogeneous and sometimes rooted in biology in ways that seem very, very limiting. So one of the ways the critique of essentialist notions of woman has been developed is through Judith Butler, who argues for the performativity and construction of both sex and gender. And this is a pretty complicated argument, and so I'm just hitting it really, really briefly and sort of feeling like I need to apologize for not doing Judith Butler justice. But her argument in kind of the most basic level is that our understanding of both biological and social differences, right? And that's big, right? Both our biological distinctions between men and women and the social distinctions is always mediated by language and concepts and are not firmly true, but also cannot be simply rejected, right? So we're always having to perform masculinity and femininity, but also perform or sort of reiterate the biological distinction between men and women. That's how they get construction, through repetition. And the repetitions don't always work because the core concept is not firm. It's not true and stable. It has to be redone over and over again. And so that's one way of sort of stepping beyond the kinds of statements Cixous was making and asking us to think about this internal construction and sort of modification with each repetition of sex and gender. Another really crucial concept, and this is probably the last one I have time to talk about today, is intersectionality. The ways in which forms of inequality are cumulative, but when taken individually, leave specific people and experiences out. So one of the most prevalent and powerful ways of thinking about this is to point out that in anti-racist work, often the neutral, unmarked category is assumed to be male. And in feminist work, often the neutral, unmarked category is assumed to be white. And so women of color end up being marginalized from both certain anti-racist movement and certain feminist movements because the intersection of race and gender leads to a different experience in a different location within institutions, within the law, that has been ignored, right? And so part of third wave feminism is looking back to second wave feminism and saying you're doing damage when you make these claims that don't attend to other categories of difference, right? That don't attend to race, to class, to ability, and so on, disability, and so on. And so I want to, I keep doing that. I want to say a little bit more about intersectionality. This is the definition from Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term. And she says, the problem with identity politics is not that it fails to transcend difference, as some critics charge, but rather the opposite, that it frequently conflates or ignores intergroup differences. Moreover, ignoring differences within groups contributes to tension among groups, another problem of identity politics that bears on efforts to politicize violence against women. Although racism and sex steadily intersect in the lives of real people, They seldom do in feminist and anti-racist practices. And so when the practices expound identity as woman or person of color as an either or proposition, they relegate the identity of women of color to a location that resists telling. And I emphasize that last bit because that's one of the, I mean, I guess I'm an English professor, so I'm interested in how we tell things, right? I'm interested in stories. But it also gets back to something that I think that is always fundamental to feminist theory and feminist work. It's trying to make visible to tell what resists telling. And intersectionality in very important ways is talking about how the identity of women of color and their location within multiple systems of discrimination makes their stories invisible, right? And so it's trying to make that more visible. And there's so much I wanted to say, but I'm gonna have one more slide and then I probably have to stop. And that is, this is another statement which I think is really about intersectionality, but it's from 1851, and it's part of Sojourner's very, very famous Ain't I a Woman speech. And so I would like to read that. She's delivering this at a women's rights convention in Akron, Ohio, again in 1851. That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? So I bring it up because this is such an important statement, but one of the things I really want to emphasize is that the waves of feminism suggest something like progress, like that Kimberly Crenshaw and the third wave are saying something that has not been said before. But Sojourner Truth shows us that in the 19th century, an intersectional analysis was evident. It was just as evident, just as sophisticated, rhetorically located, and rhetorically effective in really important ways. And it's one of the reasons that I feel like, it's one of the things that I feel the wave theory of feminism leaves out. The way the wave theory of feminism sort of focuses our attention on a certain thread, but we don't see the past in a certain way, and we're seeing other present critiques. We're sort of neglecting other present critiques. So I have a slide about why the waves, why that metaphor. I'm going to skip that, although I'm really interested in why they call them waves. I think one reason to call them waves is that, like, the generous way to think about it is that waves move forward but move back all the time as well, that there's this kind of recursive movement that suggests something like progress, but always hard fought. I think one of the strengths of the waves model is that it really does name a movement from legal recognition to an expanded idea about the construction of gender norms and other kinds of legal exclusions of women, to interrogating really problematic exclusions within feminism, and that through that process we do see real progress. But, and this gets back to the earlier comment, it is culturally and historically specific. The emphasis on progress risks masking ongoing challenges. And the emphasis on progress may also keep us from recognizing the full power of earlier activists. We might think of Sojourner Truth as a precursor to Kimberly Crenshaw that would make Crenshaw more sophisticated, rather than seeing her as a precursor who is sophisticated in the same way in a different location. This is about my work and early feminism. I will skip that. And my final question was about what comes next. Is there a fourth wave? Some people think about the fourth wave in terms of gender activism in politics in like an internet context and in a world of digital communication and really widespread communication that can be often really hostile and also really limited. Other people would think about the fourth wave in terms of better accounting for transgender and non-binary sex and gender within feminist theory and activism. One of the things I wanted to say about the waves is that there's no one is ever like, we're the first wave, right? It's a rhetorical gesture that comes from, excuse me, the second wave saying, we're different, we're moving on a little bit. And then the third wave saying, yeah, actually the second wave, you have some problems, we're moving on. And so whatever comes next, does that have to build on the third wave, or do we call it something else? I have gone over. Let me ask, are there questions or comments? Things I haven't covered, or things, you know, you'd like me to go back to? Yeah, Nicole.
Why would non-binary sex be in there if they aren't? I mean, I don't know. When you talk about non-binary, what do you mean by that?
I mean, positions in terms of sex and gender that are not either male or female.
So why would they be included in feminism if feminism is about women?
Well, I guess that's one of the questions, right? Is feminism, by saying it's only about women, limiting itself, right? And so I think that there's a lot of, well, I guess so one of the ways I would answer that, you're asking a great question, and it's a question that I think people debate a great deal. I would say that if we confine feminism to an emphasis on women as defined within a male-female binary, it's very hard to move forward politically, right? One, it's excluding people. But two, it's also reifying a distinction that, well, you know, maybe this is too simple, but I think, you know, I had that original definition I like, that feminism is the radical statement that women are people. I think to get to the people part, it's helpful to expand to the most inclusive and the most mobile definitions of sex and gender. You know, I mean, I would also argue that feminism can't only be about women in some ways, right? That men have a place in feminism. That part of what the work of feminism is interrogating masculinity. It's not my first project, right? It's not what I do, but it's not what I do, right? Like, it's part of it. I don't know. Do you buy that? Yeah. It's, you know, it's hotly debated, and I personally tend to the most, you know, mobile definitions. Yeah. Is it Torrens or Lily? I don't know if
Lily.
Lily.
I agree with you about like the mobility of the definition, and I kind of think that feminism, especially in like the most recent years, has sort of expanded to just be considered as the equality of the genders, which then includes the non-binary genders as well.
Nicole.
So how many genders are there? How many are we including in this?
Can we count them?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I can count them really. I think well, yeah, okay. So one answer is, Lily said gender is a spectrum. The idea of a spectrum has been part of, like I said, 16th and 17th century feminisms. Actually, in just 16th century ideas about gender and sex difference, it has been part of first and second wave and third wave feminisms as well. I think part of, so I resist counting from two perspectives, three perspectives. One, I just don't know enough. You know, like I haven't counted. Two, I think we might think about this in terms of the spectrum. And 3, I am pretty strongly in the position of a kind of post-structuralist critique that would say that our language limits what we can think, right? But that the critique is working against the language, right, in some ways. So a strictly binary sense of sex and gender breaks down repeatedly because of individuals and because of experiences and structures that don't fit that model. And so adding numbers is another way of sort of trying to fix it. And I think as soon as you say, well, there are 3 or there are 4, then there's going to be 5 and 6 and 7 who don't fit into those categories. And so I think that's my approach to feminist theory, is that the categories, once we have established categories, they tend to break down. I think there was some chat that I missed.
So saying that there are 2 genders would be discriminatory?
It can be discriminatory. I mean, I think it's if we're talking about discrimination, it's discriminatory if it means that people can't get jobs or are legally excluded from full rights. Is it, if you're writing a poem or literature, if you think about the world in terms of 2 genders, which, I was raised in this, I think that we're still sort of stuck with, anchored by a binary sense of sex and gender difference. Is it discriminatory? Yeah, it's a little bit limited, but it's also almost, like none of us can totally escape that. Does that make sense? Right? I think it's a problem, but it's not, it's a problem we work through and within. And also, I think all of this is, it changes situationally, right? There are times when we use different frameworks, works in different language. But I do think that feminist theory, the kind of feminist theory I've been focusing on, is almost always working against really fixed gender boxes, right? And it may be working only with a binary. A lot of times in the 19th century, though not always, there are pretty strong binaries, but the boxes have to be broken open. Yeah, okay. So sex and gender, I think this is really important, right? That sex tends to be associated with biology. That's your sex. And gender is the social experience. And so one of the ways people have approached this is to say that gender, because it's so based in socialization, tends to have, just like, again, the spectrum is very mobile. And, and you have, I don't know, so I'm trying to think of a good example. And the example that's coming to mind is tomboys, because, I guess I was a bit of a tomboy as a kid, and sort of thinking about, and still am in a way, thinking about that kind of, what that category suggests about navigating different kinds of gender expression, right? That seems like gender expression seems like a more mobile place. Sex seems to be more fixed, right? You have genetic, like genetic markers. I think 2 ways of thinking about sex as not binary is to look at sexual variations, like intersex people, right, who have both male and female genitalia. But also, and this is the Judith Butler argument, to say we have chosen to do science and categorize people according to one small genetic marker when humans are much more various than that. Like the way we conceptualize the world, even at the biological level, is driven by assumptions about binaries. Why do people have different gender? Do you want to explain that? Is this Faith or Wallace? I don't know which is your first name. Why that question?
Faith, you're on mute. You would have to turn yourself on. Sometimes she has some internet connectivity.
Okay.
Oh,
Well, let me. Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I was asking why people had a different gender from their sex.
Oh, okay. So I see what you mean. I don't know. I mean, I think people, you know, it's people are different, right? Like some people are much more what we would call cisgender, and they have gender identities that map very closely to the sex they are identified with. And other people who, you know, are on a whole spectrum of gendered gendered identities, gendered experiences.
So would that be more like a difference in personality? Or
It's a well, I mean, it's yeah, okay, it can be a matter of personality. It can be yeah, sure. I'm trying to think. It's I mean, and I guess part of what I'm saying is it's both about an individual experience of themselves in society and in a body, and with, you know, like it's about brain chemistry and body and also socialization, and but also about cultural expectations. And so I think a lot of the emphasis, for instance, on there being a difference between gender expression and sex assigned at birth, right? The sense that there's something dissonant there, that dissonance is a product of socialization and social location, right? Does that make sense? Like, I feel like people are people. They have their bodies and they live in the world, right? And that wouldn't be dissonant if the culture didn't make it dissonant, right? Otherwise, you would just be you would live your life, right? And so some of it is always about your experience of your body and your gender expression within a world that names those things in a particular way. I don't know, does that make sense? Again, it gets at really crucial question about the, you know, crucial issues that feminist theory is trying to address. How do individuals live within societies that make that divide people in particular ways, societies in which gender is an important marker of difference, right? So important that one of the first things we ask when, you know, someone's pregnant and expecting a child is, do you know if it's a boy or a girl, right? One could imagine, this is the speculation part of feminist theory, a world where no one cares, where that is not an important distinction, where they're much more interested in saying, do you know if the child is left-handed or right-handed, right? That's more important. And you know, and so there's a kind of cultural framework for all of this. At least that's how I answer it. But again, these are really controversial, debated topics. So this is my perspective.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Harvey. I feel like if I don't find a point to say we're done, we're just going to keep going.
Well, thank you very much. You can tell I could keep going forever. So I appreciate all your great questions. And thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed this.
Oh, thank you for joining us. Everybody give Dr. Harvey a virtual round of applause.
All right. I will log out. Thank you very much.
Thank
Yes.
you, Dr. Harvey.
Right. All right. Thank you very much. Enjoy your discussion.
Oh, thanks. Bye.
And I need to figure out how to get out. So
You can just press
I'll say goodbye. There it is.
All right, everyone. So it's 11:13. We're going to take a 10-minute break before we come back to lab and break some of this down, apply it to LD stuff, talk about it in terms of topics. So come back. Oh, now it's 11:14. Let's come back at 11:25. Okay, so 11 minutes, not 10. Oh, good question, Lily. Let's go to the course room. So when you come back, don't come back here, go to the course room.